The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Just over 2 weeks to go before the election, and as a new Supreme Court nominee aces her test before the Senate, Donald Trump boldly defends his record and Joe Biden takes heat over his son's shady business dealings as both candidates begin their closing arguments to an anxious American people. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We'll discuss the dueling town halls of Trump and Biden this week after their debate was canceled, and a view from those crucial states in the heartland with LibertyNation.com national columnist Sarah Cowgill. Plus, how the Democrats' most useful accessory during the pandemic is also the perfect symbol for their campaign strategy. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza joins us for Talkin' Liberty, analyzing the Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Judge Amy Coney Barrett.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. No debate this week as President Trump just said no to the virtual format ordered up by the Debate Commission. The final debate is still set for this coming Thursday. But we did get dueling town halls this week on Thursday evening, Trump on NBC, Joe Biden on ABC. And Trump was predictably subjected to the inquisitional questioning of Savannah Guthrie, as she jumped in early with the usual accusation about Trump and white supremacists, after the president did not, in the eyes of the left and the Trump-hating corporate media, sufficiently condemn them at the debate back in September.
You were asked point blank to denounce white supremacy. In the moment, you didn't.
No, you
My question to you is,
you've done this to me and everybody.
Why does it seem like
I denounce white supremacy, okay?
You did 2 days later.
I've denounced white supremacy for years. You didn't ask Joe Biden whether or not he denounces Antifa. I watched him on the same basic show with Lester Holt, and he was asking questions like Biden was a child. Are you listening? I denounce white supremacy.
Okay.
What's your next question?
Well, the next question was about QAnon, some obscure right-wing group that nobody seems to know much about, as Savannah Guthrie betrayed a very thinly veiled hatred for the president. But over on ABC, George Stephanopoulos was persistent in finally dragging an answer out of Joe Biden, kicking and screaming, on whether he would announce his position on packing the Supreme Court following the likely confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett.
You know, if I had answered the question directly, then all the focus would be on what's Biden going to do if he wins, instead of on, is it appropriate what is going on now? I have not been a fan of court packing.
So you're still not a fan?
Well, I'm not a fan. I didn't say it depends on how this turns out. Not how he wins, but how it's handled.
Well, what does that mean, how it's handled?
It depends on how much they rush this.
If they vote out before the election, you are open to expanding the court?
I'm open to considering what happens from that point on.
But don't voters have a right to know where you stand?
They do have a right to know where they stand, and they'll have a right to know where I stand before they vote.
So you'll come out with a clear position before Election Day?
Yes.
So right there, Joe Biden committed, finally, to revealing his position on court packing before November 3rd. We'll see. But Biden was not asked about an explosive report in the New York Post this week on emails appearing to prove that, contrary to his repeated denials, Biden actually met with his son Hunter's handlers at Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company that paid Hunter Biden some $50,000 a month while his father was vice president and in charge of Ukraine policy. This after Biden had for months used the Sergeant Schultz defense. He knew nothing?
How many times have you ever spoken to your son about his overseas business dealings?
I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings. I have never discussed with my son or my brother or anyone else anything having to do with their businesses, period.
Do you stand by your statement that you did not discuss any of your son's overseas business dealings?
Yes, I stand by that statement.
Do you think it was wrong for him to take that position? No. Knowing that it was really because that company wanted access to you?
Well, that's not true. You're saying things you do not know what you're talking about.
But a lot of people are talking about this. But incredibly, Facebook and Twitter actually removed all postings that included the New York Post story and even suspended Trump's campaign account for a time. And on Capitol Hill, Republican senators Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, and Josh Hawley vowed to get to the bottom of it.
This is election interference, and we are 19 days out from an election. It has no precedent in the history of democracy.
Nobody in Twitter and social media shut down anything about Trump and Russia.
And the attempt to rig an election, which is what we are seeing here by monopolies, is unprecedented in American history. They have a lot to answer for, and I hope that we'll subpoena both Twitter and Facebook.
These moves by Facebook, and particularly Twitter, could be the last straw for these giant media platforms, as the calls to remove their protection in the law through the now famous Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act are growing louder by the day and now approaching a fever pitch. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, a story that would otherwise and rightly dominate the news if it weren't for the election is producing an excellent result for Trump and the GOP as they stand at the precipice of a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. The confirmation hearings of the cool, calm, and collected Amy Coney Barrett.
I believe deeply in the rule of law and the place of the Supreme Court in our nation. I believe Americans of all backgrounds deserve an independent Supreme Court that interprets our Constitution and laws as they are written.
And that's what's driving the left crazy, that commitment to actually following the law as written instead of predetermining a preferred outcome. Among the traps the Democrats tried to set for Judge Barrett was declaring that she should recuse herself from rulings that might come before the court about the election since she was appointed by Trump. But Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham used logical questions to shoot that right down.
But do you own a gun?
We do own a gun.
Do you think you could fairly decide a case even though you own a gun?
Yes.
All right. You're Catholic.
I am.
The tenets of your faith mean a lot to you personally, is that correct?
That is true.
Can you set aside whatever Catholic beliefs you have regarding any issue before you?
I can.
Amy Coney Barrett was by most all accounts a smash hit in her hearings, always seeming to be one step ahead of the senators, not just in her knowledge of the law, but because of her persona, on full display when she, the mother of 2 adopted children from Haiti, was asked how she reacted to the killing of George Floyd.
Have you seen the George Floyd video?
I have.
What impact did it have on you?
Senator, as you might imagine, given that I have 2 black children, that was very very personal for my family. I think it is an entirely uncontroversial and obvious statement that racism persists in our country.
So ACB, as she's now called, is killing it. Her nomination well on track to full Senate confirmation by the end of this month, barring unforeseen circumstances, which in 2020, of course, do seem to be an everyday occurrence. Now, the most bizarre Say What of the Week has to go to Nancy Pelosi, appearing on CNN and shockingly dressed down on a coronavirus relief bill which she has stalled in the House by Wolf Blitzer. Listen to Pelosi's remarkable conclusion when old Wolf invoked the people still struggling with the downdraft of COVID-19.
Can you look them in the eye, Madam Speaker, and explain why you don't want to accept the president's latest stimulus offer? They really need the money right now. Even the members of your own caucus, Madam Speaker, want to accept this deal, $1.8 trillion.
What I say to you is I don't know why you're always an apologist, and many of your colleagues apologists for the Republican position.
I pretty much guarantee you that that was the first and last time CNN will ever be accused of being apologists for the GOP. It's so incredible that it qualifies as what Chevy Chase in the famed movie Christmas Vacation called a head sewn to the carpet moment. We'll break away quickly and come back with a view from the crucial battlegrounds in America's heartland on the upcoming election.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Election 2020 Big Bottom Flash Reports are coming. On election night, at the bottom of every hour, LibertyNation.com will give you Election Night 2020, 90 seconds at a time, with our Big Bottom Flash Reports. You'll get the drop with our one-stop shop. Tune into LibertyNation.com on election night for our Big Bottom Flash Reports, at the bottom of every hour. LibertyNation.com.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, we're told by polling organizations that Joe Biden is well ahead of President Trump in the race for president. But whether he is or not, no one will deny that the outcome of the election rests essentially on 6 battleground states, where the outcomes are still in doubt. Indeed, Biden's reported lead in those battlegrounds is much smaller than in the national numbers. The 6 swing states are Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, all won by Trump in 2016, along with Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all also captured by Trump 4 years ago. The first time a Republican has won any of those states since the 20th century. And that trio of states is being heavily targeted by Democrats vowing never to take them for granted again. Now, if Trump wins in those first 3 states, all the focus will center on those states behind what used to be called the blue wall, but no longer after Trump shocked the world by winning them all by narrow margins in 2016. What they have in common, those last trio of states, of course, is that they represent the American heartland. And so it is time to bring in LibertyNation.com's gal on the ground in the heartland, the inimitable Sarah Cowgill. Sarah, welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio.
Hello, Tim. Well, that was just like the best introduction ever.
Well, you're suffering from a lack of good introductions, apparently. Okay, so Sarah, give us a sense of the vibe, the buzz, the pulse on the ground as you perceive it out in your neck of the woods. Does this lead Biden reportedly holds in all these heartland states seem genuine? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I do not see, with my contacts and my friends and my sources across the heartland, I do not see Biden inching up or moving ahead of Trump any way, shape, or form. And maybe I'm looking in the wrong nook and cranny, but I'm not seeing it whatsoever.
Well, compare for us the buzz around Trump in the heartland 4 years ago when he was an upstart challenger to today when he's president.
Well, 4 years ago, people were a little on the fence. Trump is not a Republican. He has been a registered Republican. He's been a registered Democrat, but he tends to support the things that he cares about and support the policies and issues that he believes are, America first oriented. A lot of people were on the fence because of his bombastic style and his attitude. And he literally just manhandled those other candidates on the stage, during the debate season. So, when you've got that kind of personality and people were still kind of iffy about in 2016, and they still voted for him over a Democrat. Now, of course, Hillary Clinton was not very likable. I don't think Kamala Harris is likable either. And everybody knows that she's being set up as the takeover person. So this time around, those same people that might have been on the fence who have since embraced Trump and his policies and what he's doing for the country, there's no doubt in their mind who they're voting for. I can't find anybody who's out there on the fence, waiting for the magic bullet to tell them who to take out and who to vote for. I don't see it at all. I think his base has only grown over the last 4 years.
Have you met any voters in your travels that voted for Trump last time that say they will not vote for him this time?
Not a single one. Zero. And I mean, it's, I meet with the old guys at the corner cafe and they talk politics, and the guy who hated Trump 4 years ago still hates him, and everybody else that voted for Trump still voting for him.
But Sarah, we're led to believe that Joe Biden is going over bigger in the heartland than Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. Do you see that?
No. I see people talking about his cognitive decline. I see people saying we don't want Kamala Harris as the president, and that's what they're doing. They're doing an end run around the whole process. I see a lot of that kind of discussion. I don't see anybody saying around here, even with the elderly people, even with people who, the polls are shouting from the rooftops, oh my gosh, that 80-year-old just said she's voting for Biden. I don't see that here. And it goes from the young people here all the way up to the senior citizens. I don't see any kind of love for Biden here. A lot of it has to do with the Obama years. Some of it has to do with his son, and his problems, Hunter's problems with the Ukraine deals. You see some people wanting to fight that, but I think in the long term, they're going to hold their nose and they're going to vote for Trump because they don't want socialism. You're in the anti-socialism world when you're between the Appalachians and the Rockies.
Okay, Sarah. Well, thanks for joining us once again. Stay safe out there in flyover country.
Hey, I will. Thanks for having me, Tim. It's always a good time.
Sarah Cowgill, Heartland correspondent for LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss how the Democrats' favorite accessory during this pandemic is also the perfect symbol for their campaign strategy, the mask.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Folks, do you realize that the Democrats' most useful accessory during this pandemic is also the perfect symbol for their election campaign? Indeed, the most apt object defining Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the Democratic Party circa 2020 is ready-made, widely accessible, and, of course, the subject of endless conversation in the now 7-month-old era of COVID-19. But what it symbolizes in a bitter election campaign coming down the stretch serves the broader purpose of revealing the party's true campaign strategy. It's the mask. Based on his public statements on the subject, if he had his way and was unconstrained by the U.S. Constitution, Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential nominee, would order a national mandate requiring everyone to wear the mask. It's become nothing less than the symbol of state power, pressed to great political advantage by a party more than willing to exploit the widespread pain of a virulent pandemic to advance their thirst for expanded state control, while simultaneously receiving the electoral benefit of nailing the singular blame for the over 210,000 coronavirus victims to the White House door, like the 95 Theses of Martin Luther. Where would the Democrats be if they could not employ the mask for the dual purpose of justifying a basement Biden run-out-the-clock strategy, distancing their candidate far from the madding crowd of voters, and instilling a radiating fear of COVID into an already anxious populace? Where would they be if this pandemic had not changed the election year conversation away from widespread insurrection in cities that the Democrats have controlled for decades, and allowed them to mask their true beliefs on state-controlled health care, abolishing fossil fuels, raising taxes, re-regulating a deregulating economy, packing the court, and a host of other issues where the historically moderate face of their hapless presidential nominee is used as what else? A mask for the actual leftist power brokers pulling the puppet strings and holding sway behind the curtain. The mask allows Kamala Harris to position herself as a centrist, standing on a soapbox and hysterically calling Trump's response to the pandemic, quote, the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country, when her actual voting record has been rated the most liberal in the entire U.S. Senate, yes, further left even than the self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders. Their fabricated outrage at the president has allowed the Democrats to mask the truth that their own plan for the pandemic is, as Mike Pence stated in the vice presidential debate, little more than plagiarism of the Trump response. They could hardly explain how they would have operated differently had Joe Biden, instead of Donald Trump, been forced to make critical, life-altering decisions on a daily basis. But their vitriol masks the reality that things would surely have been worse under the former vice president, if only because of his opposition to Trump's early travel bans from both China and Europe, which may have saved tens or even hundreds of thousands of lives. The pandemic has allowed Biden to mask the sudden and substantial enrichment of his family's coffers immediately following his state visits to Ukraine and China, maybe elsewhere, when he served as vice president. It's provided the media wing of the Democratic Party the opening to ignore his role in spying on the Trump campaign by the Obama Justice Department, his string of head-shaking remarks about race, and a history of plagiarism damaging enough to force him out of a previous presidential race 32 years ago. And it has allowed them to mask Biden's sudden epiphany about America being systemically racist and his about-face on fracking and other issues when his statements during the primary season, including support for taxpayer-funded health care for illegals, represented open compliance with the dictates of the radical base of his party. In fact, no matter the outcome of the election, the preponderance of residual images of Biden's presidential campaign which enter the history books will undoubtedly and appropriately show the Democratic nominee wearing his omnipresent mask. Say what you will about President Trump, but few people are mystified by where he stands on any and all issues. His outspoken views on everything have undoubtedly gotten him in a whole heap of hot water. But far from masking his own beliefs, Trump has for years unmasked the very people and ideology who now use the mask to hide their own core beliefs from the voters. On November 3rd and before, will voters across the land be casting their ballots on what they are told by Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the Democrats with the mask on, or what they see when the mask is removed? We'll break away for a moment and then come back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Election 2020 Big Bottom Flash Reports are coming. On election night, at the bottom of every hour, LibertyNation.com will give you Election Night 2020, 90 seconds at a time, with our Big Bottom Flash Reports. You'll get the drop with our one-stop shop. Tune into LibertyNation.com on election night for our Big Bottom Flash Reports. At the bottom of every hour. LibertyNation.com.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curriculum. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
And now we welcome you to the portion of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitled Talkin' Liberty, as we're rejoined by our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and the man charged with being our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Okay, it's all ACB all the time. At the
overtime for the
Court
Guardian of Liberty this week with
overtime just to watch the hearings. I've watched a lot of them, but I want to start with an overarching question for those who aren't clear about it, and I call it the 40 versus 4 formulation. 40 years of Amy Coney Barrett as opposed to 4 years of Donald Trump, and I've made the argument that because of the increasing significance of the Supreme Court, that 40 years of Amy Coney Barrett for conservatives or constitutionalists is more important than 4 more years of Donald Trump. That this nomination is that serious. Do you agree?
I would say that Donald Trump's work in regulatory law may be for conservatives worth the squeeze. You know, so you're saying, would you give up, from a conservative political gain perspective or policy perspective, would you give up the Amy Coney Barrett nomination to get another 4 years of Donald Trump? It's a close call, Tim. It's not as obvious to me because justices, we don't know exactly how they're going to rule until they get on the court. We have a better idea, I think, of what Donald Trump would do. And, the things that Donald Trump has done that have been great have been crossing out these volumes of the Federal Register that make, life so choked in the United States, commercial and other activity. So we'll see.
Well, there's great hysteria on the left about a 6-3 constitutionalist majority. And I was thinking back, Scott, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the first time since the Warren Court in the 1950s and 60s that it's been so lopsided in one direction. Of course, the Warren Court was lopsided in the leftist direction.
Yes, and also all these fish that are in, you're dividing the tank of 9 into 2 tanks, and that's a bit of a broad brush, I think. Those conservatives don't all swim together on all issues, and what a Justice Gorsuch would go for or prefer versus a Justice Alito are often not the same thing.
Indeed. Think about where the court would be if John Paul Stevens and David Souter, and to some degree Anthony Kennedy, had turned out to be the so-called conservatives that they were supposed to be, and if Harry Blackmun hadn't been the guy appointed by a Republican who wrote Roe versus Wade, Earl Warren himself appointed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, this court may have looked very different over the years if the justices appointed by Republicans had turned out to be what they had thought or hoped they would be.
That's right.
Okay, now let's talk about ACB herself. Start with her temperament. I think of cool, calm, collected, confident, deferential, but in charge, one step ahead of senators.
Yes, and no surprise there, Tim. If that wasn't the case, we never would have seen her in the first place because she would not have been nominated. Just as a person who spent some years on the courts of appeal after being an esteemed law professor. So I don't think that was a surprise to anyone that she has a keen judicial temperament.
Let's talk about the recusal issue because, of course, the left wants, I wouldn't say demanding, but if they could, they would demand that she recuse herself from any decisions regarding the upcoming election because she was appointed by Trump. Give for us a sense of when a recusal of a Supreme Court justice is appropriate and when it is not.
Well, if Ms. Barrett had, for instance, worked on the Trump campaign, then it would be appropriate for her to recuse herself from cases involving the campaign. But it's up to the Supreme Court to decide when they will recuse themselves, the justices, because the Supreme Court's an independent body, and to take that direction from the U.S. Senate would be sublimating themselves to it. And the Constitution gives no guidance on recusals. So it's up to the justices themselves to determine a framework by which they will, evaluate that issue and take action when required. We don't really have, Tim, a circumstance, where there are recusal issues that are sort of genuine and founded outside of politics. Typically, recusals come forth because justices own stock in a company that may have business before the court or something rather mundane.
Yes, I believe Justice Kagan had to recuse herself from a case a couple years ago for that very reason. So it does happen, but not usually because you might decide on an issue that affects the president that appointed you. Let's talk.
That issue alone, Tim, has never before been cause for recusal. Almost every justice, I'm trying to think of, justices usually rule on issues that affect the administration before them. In other words, the only way you wouldn't is if it were an outgoing administration. Like, for instance, if there were an actual Merrick Garland confirmation, presumably he wouldn't rule on much. But even then, he would rule on, for instance, we have Obamacare in the courts, right? So that would be an issue that came up, put in play by an administration that advanced his nomination. So where does it stop? That's just a purely political maneuver, I think, not really grounded in a legal criticism.
All right, let's talk about what impact ACB might have on important cases regarding liberty. And we talked about the ACB-ACA formulation, Affordable Care Act. The left had hammered as hard as they could, not necessarily so much at her, but at the issue of her being the deciding vote to trash Obamacare. Big case coming up before the court a week after Election Day. But by most of the forecasts from people who study this stuff, it seems to me that the severability issue is not one that's likely to result in the entire law being trashed. You already have a couple of the justices that in previous rulings have hinted at the fact that one part of the law could be severed and keep the law in toto intact.
Well, that's why I use the word may, Tim. We'll have to see. Those hints and forecasts are just that. And until the justices actually examine the issue, and I hate to sound like a nominee before a Senate subcommittee hearing, but that's until the issue's actually before them and they have that specific issue briefed, then we'll see what their rule is. But it wouldn't surprise me either way if they did toss out the whole thing, which I think is clearly warranted given the text of the law and the text of the Constitution, or they try to craft some middle road. It is true that there's significant reliance interests now on many people's behalf, at least for parts of that law.
Okay, so then there's the issue of abortion, which is always an issue. It's a central issue. It may be the single most important issue for the left. And it seems, again, by most observers, equally unlikely that this court would just overturn Roe versus Wade, because we'll remember that it was a 7-2 decision, and so much other law is based on it. But what are the specific threats to current abortion law with a court including Amy Coney Barrett on it?
Tim, for the abortion question, if we're going to see more abortion restrictions in the United States be allowed by the court, I would suggest that we're likely to see them come in one by one. There will be states that pass laws that give restrictions, and then those are fought, and they basically work themselves up to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court can articulate and kind of nibble away at the current precedent, which is to grant wide latitude of rights and grant few restrictions on abortions. That states can pass few restrictions on the right to obtain an abortion. It's highly unlikely that we'll see, wholesale ripping away of abortion rights. Although I will say it is possible, Tim. I could see how an abortion case could work itself up to the Supreme Court. And by the way, this is, I think, a key for where technology would come into play. What we know about what's happening in the uterus of a pregnant woman at certain gestation periods is far different than what we knew in 1973. And whether that's a fetus or a baby or an unviable tissue mass, depending on your political and moral outlook, we know a lot more about that thing than we did before. And I could see, Tim, a court, especially one that's motivated and has a certain belief, to say that is a human being, and then therefore all abortion is illegal. So it's possible that could happen. I think it's an outside chance. I want to be clear, but it's not an impossibility. But more likely what we'll see is just the allowance of more restrictions on the right to get an abortion around the fringes, and slowly kind of narrowing in to make it a more restrictive right.
Now, the people on the left are basically warning women that this court will overturn Roe versus Wade, leading most people, I think, to believe that if Roe versus Wade is overturned, that abortion would become illegal across the country, when in fact, Scott, that decision would then be left up to the individual states, yes?
Well, it depends on how they ruled. So if they ruled the way I just discussed, then it would be illegal. But they could rule by just simply returning it to the states. That's another way to go.
Okay, finally, do you see any vulnerabilities or impediments to a smooth sail to confirmation for Amy Coney Barrett outside of political machinations?
If I were a betting man, I'd bet on she's the next Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
You'd put down $100, Scott, probably to get one back.
That'd be the solid bet, though, in this instance.
No question. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Scott Cosenza, Legal Affairs Editor of LibertyNation.com. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.